In the heart of Cambodia, a revolution promised purity and rebirth, but delivered silence, graves, and fear. Under a single unyielding vision, an entire nation was dismantled, piece by piece. Cities emptied, families vanished, histories fractured. Tonight, we uncover the rise, rule, and ruin of Pol Pot. Before the world knew his name, he was simply a quiet student with radical dreams. Long before Pol Pot became synonymous with terror, he was born Saloth Sâr on May 19, 1925, in a rural village of Prexbao, French-controlled Cambodia. His family was relatively comfortable by local standards, connected to minor nobility and the royal court. The proximity to village would later clash sharply with the revolutionary image he carefully constructed, one of peasant purity and ideological sacrifice. As a young man, Saloth Sâr received an education uncommon for many Cambodians of this time. He attended schools in Phnom Penh before traveling to Paris in the late 1940s on a government scholarship. There, far from the rice fields he would later mythologize, he encountered Marxist ideology in student circles shaped by post-war radicalism. He was not an exceptional scholar, but he was attentive, absorbing ideas about class struggle, anti-colonialism, and revolutionary rebirth. Paris became a crucible. Saloth Sâr joined clandestine communist groups where discipline, secrecy, and ideological purity were prized above debate or compassion. These environments rewarded obedience and certainty, traits that would later define his leadership. When he returned to Cambodia in the early 1950s, he brought with him not just political theory, but a rigid worldview that divided society into enemies and instruments. In Cambodia, he worked quietly as a teacher while embedding himself deeper into underground communist networks. He avoided attention, cultivated loyalty, and learned to operate in shadows. By the 1960s, Saloth Sâr had adopted the name Pol Pot and risen within the Communist Party of Cambodia, positioning himself as a disciplined revolutionary rather than a charismatic firebrand. The early chapter reveals a man shaped not by chaos, but by order. Someone who believes society could be rebuilt through control, obedience, and erasure. The ideals forged in classrooms and secret meetings would soon be tested on an entire nation, with consequences few could have imagined. Revolutions rarely arrive with warning. Often, they grow quietly, patient, and unseen. Throughout the 1960s, Cambodia drifted toward instability, and Pol Pot moved deliberately within that uncertainty. As civil war spread and political authority weakened, he and his allies reshaped the Communist Party of Cambodia into a rigid, secretive force. Leadership was concealed, decisions centralized, and dissent quietly eliminated. What emerged was not a mass movement, but a disciplined machine built for absolute control. Pol Pot positioned himself as the invisible center of this system. Unlike public revolutionaries, he avoided speeches and spectacle. Power, in his view, was more effective when unchallenged and unseen. The Khmer Rouge leadership operated anonymously, referring to itself simply as Ankar, the organization. To followers, Ankar was omnipresent, unquestionable, and abstract, a force rather than a group of men. The Cambodian Civil War intensified after the 1970 overthrow of Prince Norodom Sihanouk. Rural populations, displaced by bombing and instability, became fertile ground for recruitment. Pol Pot exploited resentment towards cities, intellectuals, and foreign influence, presenting the countryside as morally pure and historically betrayed. Loyalty was rewarded, doubt was noted. By April 17th, 1975, Phnom Penh fell. The victory was swift and nearly bloodless, but what followed revealed the true nature of Pol Pot's vision. Within hours, the city was emptied. Hospitals were abandoned. Families were separated at gunpoint. The evacuation was framed as temporary, necessary, even benevolent. In reality, it marked the beginning of a total societal dismantling. Pol Pot soon declared the start of Year Zero. History, culture, religion, and identity were treated as contaminants. Money was abolished. Schools closed. Private life ceased to exist. Cambodia was renamed Democratic Cambodia, and Pol Pot became its undisputed leader. Though his face and voice remained largely absent, his rise was not dramatic, but surgical. Power was secured through silence, obedience, and fear. Conditions carefully cultivated long before the world realized what Cambodia had become. What followed was not chaos, but a system, precise, relentless, and unforgiving. Under Pol Pot's rule, violence was not random. It was organized, rationalized, and enforced through policy. The Khmer Rouge sought to create an agrarian utopia by erasing every trace of the old society. Intellectuals, professionals, religious figures, ethnic minorities, and even former revolutionaries were identified as threats. Guilt required no evidence. Suspicion alone was enough. Daily life became a cycle of forced labor, surveillance, and deprivation. Entire populations were marched into the countryside and assigned to collective farms, where exhaustion was constant and individuality forbidden. Families were deliberately separated. Children were taught loyalty to Ankar above parents, replacing kinship with ideology. Trust dissolved. Silence became survival. The regime relied heavily on confession culture, accusations often extracted under pressure, created chains of guilt that spread endlessly. One confession produced many names, each leading to further arrest. Facilities like Tuao Slang, known internally as S-21, became administrative centers of elimination. Prisoners were photographed, cataloged, and processed with chilling efficiency. Very few ever left alive. Pol Pot framed this destruction as purification. Deaths were described as necessary sacrifices in the pursuit of a flawless society. Starvation, overwork, and disease were dismissed as failures of the individual, not the system. Responsibility was abstracted upward to Angkor, shielding leadership from accountability while ensuring obedience below. What made the crimes especially devastating was their impersonality. There were no public trials, no visible decrees of death, only disappearances. Neighbors vanished, villages empty. The absence of information created an atmosphere where fear replaced resistance. By the time doubt surfaced, it was already dangerous to speak. These methods were not excess of revolution. They were its core mechanics. Pol Pot's Cambodia became a nation where ideology outweighed life, and control was maintained not through spectacle, but through quiet, methodical erasure. Even the most rigid systems crumble when the world outside refuses to comply. By the late 1970s, Pol Pot's democratic Cambodia was reeling from its own policy. Starvation, disease, and exhaustion plagued the population. Yet the regime persisted in its radical transformation. The world began to take notice as refugee accounts trickled across borders, describing emptied cities, mass graves, and the silent suffering of millions. Cambodia, once rich in culture and history, was reduced to fear and labor. Tensions with neighboring Vietnam escalated. Border skirmishes in 1977 and 1978 were met with uncompromising retaliation by the Khmer Rouge. Pol Pot's ideology demanded absolute sovereignty, and any foreign interference was deemed as an existential threat. This hostility culminated in a full-scale Vietnamese invasion in December 1978, a decisive intervention that would bring the regime to its knees. Phnom Penh fell to Vietnamese forces on January 7, 1979. The capital, once bustling with life, revealed the aftermath of Pol Pot's vision. Hollowed out buildings, mass graves, and citizens scarred by malnutrition and trauma. The world finally glimpsed the scope of the atrocities, the organized, systemic eradication of nearly 2 million people, executed with an almost bureaucratic precision. Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge retreated west, continuing guerrilla campaigns from remote border regions. The Vietnamese-installed government publicly denounced him, yet his influence persisted among loyalists and within the shadows of Cambodian society. International recognition was complicated. Geopolitical tensions during the Cold War allowed Pol Pot to maintain a presence in exile, his crimes partially obscured by politics and propaganda. The collapse of Pol Pot's direct rule revealed the limits of secrecy and terror. Testimonies from survivors, abandoned documentation, and the sheer scale of human loss brought the world face to face with the consequences of unchecked authority. The veil of invisibility was torn, exposing a regime that had treated human lives as expendable instruments of ideology. The magnitude of suffering and the meticulous methods of oppression solidified Pol Pot's place among history's most devastating tyrants. Even decades later, the shadow of Pol Pot lingers over Cambodia, a nation scared by ambition and ideology. Pol Pot died quietly on April 15th, 1998, in a remote Cambodian village, evading full justice. His death closed the final chapter of his life, but not of his impact. Estimates suggest that 1.5 to 2 million people, roughly a quarter of Cambodia's population, perished under his regime. Families, communities, and the social fabric of the nation were shattered, leaving trauma that continues to echo across generations. Psychologically, Pol Pot exemplifies a combination of ideological rigidity, authoritarian control, and moral detachment. He believed in a vision so absolute that human life became secondary to its fulfillment. Obedience replaced empathy, and suspicion justified elimination. Scholars described him as both disciplined and fanatical, a man who measured loyalty, fear, and efficiency over compassion or justice. His detachment allowed cruelty to be administered impersonally, transforming the mechanics of governance into instruments of terror. The legacy of Pol Pot is multifaceted. Cambodia has worked tirelessly to rebuild, with memorials like the Killing Fields and Tuol Sleng standing as stark reminders of what unchecked power can achieve. Education and testimony of survivors aim to prevent the erasure of history, ensuring future generations remember the human cost of extremism. At the same time, the political vacuum and instability he left behind fueled decades of tension, creating ongoing challenges for reconciliation and governance. Pol Pot's story is a study in the dangers of absolute authority fused with ideology. It illustrates how disciplined intellect, when unmoored from morality, can orchestrate catastrophe. His life compels reflection not only on Cambodia's past, but on the universal risks posed when ideals override humanity. The shadow of his vision endures, a chilling testament to the human capacity for systemic destruction cloaked in the guise of utopia. The story of Pol Pot is one of ideology, control, and unimaginable suffering. He transformed vision into machinery, replacing families with labor, cities with fields, and culture with silence. Millions of lives were extinguished under a regime that measured loyalty in obedience and human value in utility. Yet, even in death, his shadow lingers, etched in Cambodia's soil, memories and monuments. The rise and fall of Pol Pot serves as a haunting reminder of what occurs when power, dogma, and moral detachment converge. It challenges us to scrutinize authority, question obedience, and recognize the thin line between ideology and devastation. Learning from history, we honor those who perished and ensure their stories are never forgotten. If this exploration into one of history's darkest figures left an impression, remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more journeys into the shadowed corners of our past. And as always, don't forget to look beyond the fog.